everybody. We're really very excited about this morning's or this evening's or this afternoon's webinar. It's from Setbacks to Comebacks, and this is a really important topic that I think all of us you are concerned about, particularly as we all face crisis after crisis. But this is really all about how do we deliver personalized strategies for organizational resilience. So how do we work with our teams, with individuals within our teams to help give them the resources, the support, and the capabilities to navigate prolonged uncertainty. And so our agenda for today, we're going to talk a little bit about the interplay between personal resilience after we go through some introductions. And then we're going to dive into what we do about it, which I think is a really important step, particularly around this topic, which tends to stay at the 40,000 foot view. I think we all acknowledge there is a relationship there, but what do we do about it? So we're gonna talk about that. And at the end of this, we've actually got some resources, a toolkit, if you will, for you to take back to your teams, and as a means to really engage on this topic and drive progress really around understanding the relationship between personal resilience and organizational resilience, and how do we ultimately build a more resilient team. So a few matters of housekeeping. As you know, as with all Luminar webinars, this is designed to be interactive. It's all about engagement. So please jump in with your thoughts in the chat box or raise your hand if you have something to say. No right or wrong answers. If you strongly believe that personal resilience is not tied to organizational resilience, we want to hear about that too. We will be recording today's session for others that may be missing it. The slides and the recording will be available on our website later today, and we'll email it to you as well. We are using interactive polling software. We use an app by the name of Mentimeter to engage with all of you. It makes it fun. But to participate, please visit menti.com and enter the code 18373206, or you can just scan the QR code on the right hand of your screen, and we will be sharing that code as we go through the polls. So fantastic. So I think many of you already know me, but Paula Fontana, I lead global marketing at Luminar, and I'm joined here today by our esteemed guest, Katie Belfi. Katie, you want to take a couple minutes to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah. I'm first of all, Paula, thank you so much for having me today. I have enjoyed putting this together with you so much because it's something that we're both so passionate about, and I think that the partnership that we've created really is allowing us to take this into a completely different space. And so I'm really excited about sharing all of this with all of you. And so just a little bit about who I am and why I'm here. I am a resilience coach and consultant. I've come to this place in my career through a very winding path. I started out as an attorney in the private sector, and my love of emergency management and my passion for resilience started when I became an attorney for FEMA. I joined the agency just weeks before Hurricane Sandy and ended up being the only attorney in the state of New York when the storm made landfall, and I had been on the job for just a few weeks. So that was really my first foray into emergency management, and the first time personal resilience became very, very real to me. And from there, I developed a career in emergency management, worked for NYU Langone, helped build that enterprise resilience program from the ground up post Sandy. And years later, went out on my own as a consultant, helping organizations develop enterprise resilience, organizational resilience, operational resilience, whatever words you want to use to describe this process. And along the way, I realized how much of a hole there was in really talking about and addressing personal resilience in that context. So that's what brought me to where I am today. And I'm so glad to be here with all of you.
Thank you, Katie. We're excited to have you. So just to kick off the conversation, and then we're going to tee up a poll for all of you to get your perspectives on this topic. But And if you joined Illuminar webinars in the past, you're probably not a stranger to this slide, um, but I think, particularly as we've all been navigating crisis after crisis, I think a lot of the focus has turned to how do we properly equip our teams with these fundamental principles of modern agility, right? Or navigating through change or resilience or whatever label you want to put on it. But effectively, the core assets that we need in order to navigate any kind of crisis, right? Whether it's personal related or whether it's something professional, organizational, you need a good understanding of what's happening around you. You need the tools and the capabilities and the skill sets to navigate those situations. And you also need the connectivity, right? You need that connection back to others that surround you in order to effectively, get the right support, make the necessary connections. No man is an island, and so how do we work together to really surmount many of these challenges that we're all experiencing? But one of the things, Katie, that you talk about quite a bit is sort of this balance between continuity or that short-term focus on ensuring that you're able to maintain whether it's continuity of service or maintain even daily life, right? The kind of your operating routines, if you will. Against sort of this idea of long-term longevity. And so we wanted to put that out to this group as a question. As you think about your organization's current focus, are you more tuned into short-term continuity, or are you really focused on the long term? So we'll give folks a couple of minutes to respond to that. Katie, do you want to reflect on some of your observations on this dynamic?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want to influence the poll answers. So I just want to give people a few minutes to respond. But when I talk about the difference between continuity and longevity, and first of all, I have to preface this with there's no shame in prioritizing continuity. We all need to prioritize continuity. But as it becomes more and more certain that our world is defined by endless change and endless challenge with the disasters that we're seeing sort of one after another, the thing that's come into focus for me is the difference between the two. So when we talk about continuity, we're talking about our ability to continue doing what we've always done. But when we're talking about longevity, it's nuance. What we're talking about is being able to do what needs to be done when the scenario changes. And so what's inherent in longevity is this agility that we're trying to develop in sort of developing continuity. But if you think about the practices associated with continuity versus longevity, they're quite different, because when you're thinking about longevity, you're potentially thinking about conflict, disaster, adversity that you haven't already faced. And so you might not have a plan for it. So when I'm looking towards helping an organization develop longevity, I'm thinking about what are the characteristics, what are the skill sets that need to be in place to ensure that when you don't have a plan for it.
Yeah.
I'm loving the way this poll is going. This is perfect.
But I think to your point, it's really about the balance, right? It's not that continuity is not important, but it's about how do you maintain that long-term view amidst all of this firefighting that we're doing, right? And I think there's no shortage of examples out there in terms of how we've been putting off the long term in favor of the short term kind of fixer upper sort of approach. And I think we're seeing the results of that, right? And I think there's been we're going to talk a bit about micro simulations and their role in helping you plan for situations that you've never really encountered before, right? But I think there is that element of scenario thinking, putting yourself in situations that that you haven't experienced before as a means to really develop the muscle memory for not only the short term, those things that are really on the immediately on the horizon, but also those things that are down the road. So you have ample time to ensure that you're able to build the skills and capability that you need to meet those challenges when they come.
That's right. And yeah, I mean, I think it goes without saying, but I just want to be clear that you can't have one without the other. Well, you can't have longevity if you don't have continuity. So you need to be delivering that focus on continuity. But the message that I hope to really drive home today is that there's ways to amplify your existing continuity efforts to enable them to really help you soar into the next decade, with that longevity. I'm gonna share my screen, and thank you everyone for participating. It makes it a lot more fun when we have a live audience and people are engaged. To that end, if you want to interrupt us, please feel free to do so. So I'm gonna just get my slides up, and you can feel free to interrupt me whenever you need to. Let's get that presenting. Can everybody see that?
We can.
Awesome. So I love this question, continuity versus longevity, because number one, I think that it's a critical question that we all need to be asking ourselves. But it also is a perfect way to introduce the work that I do and what I want to share with you today, because I talk about what I do in the context of revolutionized resilience. And it's not just a catchy marketing phrase, good alliteration. It's actually something that I really believe. And it's focused on the way this word has evolved. So its humble beginnings, resilience sort of came on the scene back in the 17th century as a word that was used to describe a type of matter that was able to retake its shape after it's been impacted by some force. And obviously, over the years, it's been adopted by psychology, and then later, every industry under the sun and every discipline, especially post-COVID. This word has gotten more play than maybe any other. But what's happened with this word is that it's shifted from this quality that is bouncing back to where we were before the impact to something that includes an aspect of growth and development. So it's not just bouncing back to where we were, but it's also bouncing forward to where we want to be. And for me, that's a really exciting way to think about resilience, because it's taking it and turning it into something that we can use to actually help us develop that longevity. This is the quality that gives us the capability to adapt, to anticipate, and to be agile. And now, because resilience has been around for so long and applied across so many disciplines, there are so many definitions. And so I have to admit that this is just one way of talking about resilience, but it is the way that I like to talk about resilience. And so with all of these definitions, I mean, shoot, we can't even agree on whether it's business resilience or organizational resilience. It can be a difficult thing to really wrap your hands around. But there's one thing that we can agree on, and at least most of us, and that's that it's important. So a recent study conducted by SAS revealed that 97% of executives believe business resilience is important. And now, based on the events of the last couple of years, that's not really surprising. But what was surprising were the results of the other side of this question. Okay, you think it's important, but do you believe you have it? When executives were asked this question, only 47% of that same group said, yeah, I think my organization is resilient. So it got me thinking about how we explain that gap. And, I think part of it will always be this sort of lack of a unified definition. If we can't define what resilience is, it will always be difficult to say, yes, affirmatively, that's something I have. But I think there's something else that's keeping us from being more like the Karate Kid, delivering a knockout kick to risk, being able to stay on our feet and maintain our balance, and a little bit more like Karate Kids, who are sort of dancing around it, have a general idea of the focus, but not necessarily landing that impact and achieving what we're shooting for when it comes to resilience. So what is it that made only 47% of executives say, yes, I'm resilient. My organization is resilient. Well, if you ask me, and obviously none of you have, but I'm going to tell you what I think anyway, it's all about risk. Because when we're talking about resilience, inherently, we're talking about risk, understanding it, being able to measure it, being able to manage it. And risk is tricky. It's constantly changing and evolving alongside our organization. And as our organization continues to change, our risk profile continues to change. So maintaining that awareness around risk is extremely challenging. And by the way, it's sort of a collateral duty alongside the other things you have to do, like continuing to operate your business and keep it productive and keep it profitable and keep your employees happy. So it's sort of a giant weight to lift. But that awareness is the first step. And I love sharing this concept with business leaders because it's, number one, it's super applicable and super important, but it's also a great illustration of how business resilience and personal resilience are so parallel. Because if you've ever tried to work on yourself in any capacity, you know that if you don't have self-awareness, you can't change anything. You can't change a behavior that you're not aware of. Same applies for an organization. If you're not truly aware of your organizational risk, of the things that pose the greatest threat to you and how you can change them, and whether you're actually capable of dealing with them, you're not in a position to dance around it. You're not agile. You're not ready to move. So when we talk about this awareness, I love sharing the results of this PwC pulse survey. So PwC conducted their pulse survey last year. No, I'm sorry, it was 2023, it was this year. And they surveyed 600 executives focused on exactly this thing, awareness around business risk. And the first two, the top two risks that executives reported as presenting either a serious or moderate threat to their organizations, cyber attacks and economy. Can we guess what the third one is? I can't see the chat. So Paul, you'll have to tell me if I have any guesses.
No guesses yet.
Oh, come on. Somebody's got an opinion. Somebody's got a thought. Ransom. Any others?
Resiliency from Ken.
All right, big reveal.
From Sharon.
It's our people. 71% of the executive surveyed reported that the retention and acquisition of talent was the third most impactful threat that they were thinking about. It was either serious or a moderate threat to their ability to continue operating the way they wanted to. And now we like to think about the Great Resignation as sort of in the rear view, and we're hoping that quiet quitting is quieting down. But if we look at the stats, they tell a different story. Our friends at Gallup conducted their usual global workforce review, and their report for 2023 reflected that 52% of employees are just generally not engaged. Those are quiet quitters. 17% are actively disengaged. Those people are walking out the door. And 47% reported an intent to leave. That's almost half of the workforce looking to go elsewhere. And on the other side, just 31% reported thriving. Now, I hate to tell you this, but the thriving stat is down from 2022, and everything on the other side of the screen is up from 2022. So we're still dealing with a massively disengaged workforce. And now this isn't news. Everybody knows that we've been dealing with employee engagement, and plenty of HR professionals have this front of mind, and it's a priority, and they're working on it. But there's one path to engagement that's not getting nearly enough attention, in my opinion, and that's personal resilience. Research that's been done around organizational resilience, taking a specific look at individual resilience in that context, shows that increasing personal resilience of employees not only improves their engagement and thus improves retention, but it also improves their productivity, increases job satisfaction, and drives overall well-being. Now, to understand why, we have to look a little bit at the science of personal resilience. Now, the word is often conflated with grit and perseverance. And at this point, you understand that I'm a word person. I care about the definition of words. So I'm here to tell you that resilience is not grit. It's not perseverance. Though those are part of the equation, they are far from synonyms. And the reason why is that resilience is actually a neuroplastic adaptation in our brain. And now the graphics that I'm going to use to explain this are a little bit technical, but bear with me. I'll explain that. So when we look at what's happening in our brain when it comes to resilience, when our brain senses a threat, whether that be a bear or a tiger or a scary email from our boss, the same thing happens. The part of our brain called the amygdala starts firing. And that's where the fight, flight, or freeze response lives. These are those very technical neuroscience graphics that I mentioned. And when that happens, one of the other parts of our brain, our prefrontal cortex that controls executive function goes offline. And so we're poised to take these actions. We're running away, we're going to fight for our lives, or we freeze because we can't do anything else. But what resilience does is it helps our brain make the shift from that amygdala that's firing to getting our prefrontal cortex back online. And so that means instead of reacting from that super emotional, stressed out state, we're able to turn back on our cognitive function. And that means we can make better decisions, we can problem solve, we're better able to communicate. We're using our judgment. We're not reacting, we're responding. And so if we think about what that means, imagine being able to respond to a super stressful event instead of just shooting from the hip. Well, this is the key to unlocking all of these benefits. It's the key to helping us stay present in those really stressful moments, to make better decisions, to stay engaged, to ask questions, to communicate. And what that drives is a growth mindset, which allows us to make mistakes without taking them super personally. We can get over the emotional response of those mistakes and find ways to learn from them. We stay curious. Our well-being is improved because we're less impacted by those negative emotions that come with stress. And overall, this cultivates self-awareness and self-efficacy that allows us to be those super engaged, productive, curious, driven employees, because we're not living in that super stressed out amygdala firing brain. So I get it. It's very clear that there are great personal benefits to developing individual resilience, but I know the question is, what does that really mean for organizations? So I'm going to flip this back to Paula, because I want to know what you think it means to organizations.
Yeah, it looks like we've already got a few people weighing in here, with many of us believing that individual resilience contributes significantly to organizational success. But if you haven't answered the poll, maybe weigh in, take a couple minutes just to reflect and weigh in. Yeah, how strongly do you think that whole concept of personal resilience impacts our ability to successfully organize, as companies, as communities, etc.? I did want to bring up, while we're waiting for those results, I did want to bring up, came across this study just in our article from BCG in preparing for this webinar. And I really, because I think often, I feel like there's kind of a community thought around personal resilience, which can quickly get very touchy-feely, or at least there's a perception thereof. And then there's this concept of organizational, or operational, or systemic ecosystem sort of resilience, right? Where we tend to focus. And so although there is this acknowledgement that there is this interplay, like the two generally don't meet in some capacity, right? And I love the way they framed in this particular article. They really called out the fact that organizational and personal resilience are in many ways mirrors of one another. And if you look at this really around the impact of an actual shock, there are aspects of what we do, both as practitioners and leaders in the industry, but also as individuals that help us better adapt in the face of challenges, right? There's the anticipation of disruption or change, et cetera. So anticipating those things before they are to happen. And that happens at an organizational level, but it also happens at a very individual level. There's the cushioning advantage. So what do you do in the midst of that shock? And how do you better prepare individuals and teams and organizations to respond to the event? There's the actual adaptation to the event and maybe the sustained ramifications or changes, the ripple effect, sort of post-shock. And then there's the shaping advantage. How do we leverage the insights of what we know about this new reality, and what has worked and what hasn't worked, right? To really shape our organizations, our teams, ourselves going forward. And I just thought this was, and I'll share this article in the chat for those that want to read it, but I thought it did just such a nice job, not to influence the results of the survey, of course, but I think like really to assess how many of us are charged with creating more effective and more resilient organizations and teams and ecosystems, really thinking more diligently about how those things come together. So it looks like we are relatively well aligned, like within some degree of difference here. But I think more or less it looks like, Katie, that we do agree. As an audience, this is something that there is a significant relationship between personal and organizational resilience.
I'm so happy to hear that. And thank you for sharing your the BCG paper. I was going to reference that coming up. So you got it. Let's make sure I'm sharing the right screen. Are those my slides?
I can see your slides.
Great, perfect. So that BCG article, really perfectly illustrates the sort of way personal resilience benefits an organization in sort of those general terms. I love the categories that they use. But talking more on a micro level, we already talked about engagement and productivity, but research has also shown that increased individual resilience drives innovation for your organization, collaboration, results in better feedback loops. Resilient people, number one, receive feedback better, but they're also more inclined to give honest feedback because they're in a place where they're embracing a growth mindset. And so being told that they've done something that needs improvement is not necessarily interpreted as a character flaw. They're able to use that to actually learn from it. And that drives that benefit that was in that last column of the BCG matrix that Paula shared. And so then on the flip side of this, you see less absenteeism, you see less turnover, you see less burnout. And ultimately, that ends up reflecting in your bottom line, not just because of reduced healthcare costs, but the statistics are actually pretty incredible. And Forbes agrees that focusing on people helps us maximize our revenue growth, but there's also more specific stats that we can look at. So UPenn did a research study looking at the effect of resilience training specifically on salespeople, and they saw a 23% higher sales rate for those salespeople that had resilience training versus those who didn't. You want to talk dollars? Johnson & Johnson reported a $25 million savings over 6 years based solely on their wellness and prevention program that included resilience training. And so when people ask me about the business case for resilience training, I point to this real life ROI. They reported a $2.71 ROI on what they invested in their individual resilience of their employees. Better Up is a company that does resilience training. They do coaching, executive training, and employee training for corporations, but they have a research arm. And the research done by those scientists found that the organizations within their company that saw the highest increase in individual employee resilience also saw significantly higher revenue growth, and by way of 3.2x as compared to organizations that didn't see the same increase. And finally, back to our engagement friends at Gallup, they saw a 21% increase in productivity for employees that received resilience training, specifically because of how it changed their engagement. Now, that BCG article talks about personal resilience and organizational resilience as a multi-layer relationship, which is exactly how I talk about it. But because I am who I am, I use dessert because why not? And the way I think about it is not just individual and organizational resilience, but there's a third tier in the middle. It's team resilience. And so not only is individual resilience a component of an effective holistic resilience strategy, it's foundational, because the resilience that you can build within your teams and ultimately within your organization are not just buoyed by your individual resilience, they're enabled. It's enabled. Think about how much you've invested in cultivating emergency plans, running drills, strategizing about how you're going to respond to an emergency. If at the end of the day, the people you're leaning on to implement those plans are not personally resilient, how effective do you think they're going to be? Or even on facing your day-to-day agility. If your employees, and not, by the way, not just your employees, your managers, your executive leaders, don't have that personal resilience that allows them to weather the storm, how effective are they going to be at helping you manage the next adversity, anticipate the next change that needs to be made? And the other side of this is true. If you are compromising the individual resilience of your people, it's going to look something like this. I mean, it's absolutely tragic. Poor cake. And, when we talk about how do we compromise individual resilience, there is no question that individual resilience for your employees cannot exist if they're not working in an environment and in a culture that supports and enables it. If you want to give your employees a resilience training, you host a webinar, you have a keynote speaker come in, you allow them to speak, you do it one time. You don't make any other changes. You don't turn the mirror on your organization to really consider what is the organization doing to support the resilience of these people. It's like teaching someone French and then dropping them in Germany and expecting them to be able to get by. It just doesn't work. You need both sides. And now I want to flip it back over to Paula for one more question about how you're currently investing in your employee resilience. I should stop saying employee. It's really your people resilience. Nice. Oh my God, I love the Elmo graphics. Ooh, we're sleeping on it. I love the honesty. Please be honest. For those evaluators, I hope we have time at the end for a little bit of a discussion, because I want to hear more about that evaluation. What are the questions that you're asking? What information would be helpful for you to make that decision? And for our yesers, I want to hear why you made that decision, how you made it. And then for our sleepers, we're going to wake you up.
I think I'd be interested in hearing maybe some folks from the audience talk about how they have invested in personal resilience training, because I think there's a lot of different flavors of this.
Yeah.
And what have they found works? Yeah, so we have a few comments. So Leah was talking about how training employees in resilience is designed to make them more situationally aware, which should make them recognize personal and business concerns more quickly. It's interesting to have a measurement of ROI on resilience training. It can be a very squishy topic. And then Tom, says that employees trained in personal resilience are better positioned to survive a crisis, which brings them back to work quicker. A plan is no good without the employees there to execute it. Absolutely. Anyone want to
Yeah.
share what they're doing? For those that are in the yes column, curious about what you have in place. See if anyone has their hand up. That's okay if you don't want to share too. So Tom says down here in Florida, we would host an annual hazard fair for employees. Vendors include insurance companies, Home Depot, Lowe's, public agencies, et cetera, to help employees identify ways to be better protected and more resilient. That's
Awesome. So
great.
really focusing on the personal preparedness aspect
Yeah.
of resilience, which is, I mean, to Tom's point that he made earlier, if you're better equipped to respond to an emergency personally, you're
Yeah.
able to deal with work and not just focus on the impacts of the emergency. Yeah.
Yeah. This takes me back to a conversation I had with Lisa Jones. This is going back a couple months ago, and she was talking about um, like really the criticality of focusing on employees, as part of the acute phase of the crisis, right? And because ultimately your employees allow you to serve your customer, and so without that focus on like the lifeblood of your business, um, things can quickly spiral.
Hmm.
Sharon has actually, Jason's got a comment here. I look at team member well-being, self-care, adaptability, self-efficacy, dig into purpose and meaning, and bringing in mental health professionals for employees. Linda has a comment here. I can't take credit as our HR team led the effort, but many things done to support mental health, including employee resource groups, access to the Calm app, this amazing app, helper messaging from executive level supporting self-care. I think that tone from the top is so key in terms of,
100%.
we were just talking about that this morning. There's a new article out, and we'll share it in the chat here momentarily. It was talking about how surgeons are really struggling because they've built this entire culture of being self-sufficient, and essentially, being superhuman.
Hmm.
The reality is, I think, for a lot of professions, that is sort of the ideal like persona that we built of ourselves, right? But I think the reality is, especially in sustained crisis, we do need the support and the knowledge, and in a lot of ways we need to develop new skill sets to navigate some of this new uncertainty and some of these novel risks. So I think there's no shame in admitting that you need help, and but I think also, like, how do you provide practical resources? And these are really great ideas that everyone's contributing in the chat. I really like the idea of teaming up with the corporate wellness team. From AJ, BCP currently provides awareness to the Ready.gov resources as a promotion of personal resiliency. We run the typical fire and tornado drills along with the work from home exercises. And Jason also says it's enabled by the EAP, team building, outings, lunch and learns, CPR. So this is more around connectivity, which I love. And Leah is talking
Nailed
about,
it.
yeah, the
That's
technical preparedness training.
Yeah, I
This,
was just going to respond. It's really interesting. Like, and this could be that people are just sharing pieces of what they do, but it seems that we have people that are sort of, their efforts are more focused on that personal preparedness side of resilience. And then there are others that are looking at sort of the mental health, personal, physical well-being as part of that resilience framework. But I mean, the real money is in looking at personal resilience holistically and understanding that those are all components of a larger whole.
yeah. Yeah, Ripcord can also be a fantastic resource for personal safety training.
It's great. Awesome. And thank you so much for sharing this information, because it can feel like there isn't a lot going on when it comes to personal resilience within organizations, because there is a pretty frequent resistance to this concept as something that doesn't have a place at the resilience table. You know, it's like we're talking about operational resilience. Don't get it confused. But what research shows is that it's actually an inherent part of that resilience. And, you know, in addition to all of the great efforts that you guys shared, I just want to share a bit about the types of tools that research shows to be really effective in terms of building that personal resilience. So, by all means, keep doing everything that you're doing. What we have learned is that it can be really effective for these measures to be integrated into the day to day of an employee. That allows it to be deliberate and continual and integrated. And it also lends to a collaborative effort between the organization and the employee. So I'm sure you've witnessed this in your organizations when any kind of wellness benefit is sort of delivered in a silo, it doesn't get very far. When there is a collaborative effort between the organization and the employee to, number one, push it out, but more importantly, to integrate it through the messaging, through the culture around it, and through the energy through which it's delivered, it makes a massive difference. But what's really interesting about embedding these trainings into day-to-day practice is that it seems that when we allow employees to build this practice in real time, dealing with their day-to-day stress, and they cultivate resilience around the adversity that they face in their normal day job, research shows that they are the employees that are better equipped to demonstrate that adaptive resilience during a disaster. So it's, you know, there's this difference between state and trait resilience. So, you know, when people talk to me about this, they often say, well, instead of training for it, why don't we just hire for it? Well, the truth of the matter is, resilience that you demonstrate in your day to day life, as, you know, I'm just a resilient person, doesn't necessarily translate into resilience to deal with your day to day adversity, which is that state resilience that you need to develop over time. I mean, I just had an experience with this in my personal life. I have been dealing with disasters my whole life. But professionally, I've been doing this for more than a decade. And I had my first sort of, it was small, but I had my first fire in my house. And watching myself respond to it was really interesting because I have been prepared for this forever. But watching the reaction of sort of that fight or flight, I definitely had that freeze moment where I had to shift to that cognitive brain and say, oh my God, I know how to do this. But I had that state resilience because it was something that I had practiced. And this is why this type of training is so effective for our employees. And what this leads to is the conclusion that Paul and I have come to, which has really driven this partnership, is that micro simulations are an incredible way to teach and train personal resilience. And now, if you are lucky enough to be a client of Illuminar or you have been part of their webinars, you're familiar with their micro simulations. And beyond the benefits of why micro learning is so effective for resilience, there's also the sort of macro benefits of micro learning that neuroscience keeps delivering for us. It seems that, you know, we're all walking around with these brains that are constantly consuming and they're really overloaded. And so micro learning allows us to reduce our cognitive overload while also fitting this training into the way we would normally solve problems in life. And the added benefit for employers is that it's minimally distractive and it's also scalable. You can keep building on it. It's trackable. You can develop a way of sort of assessing where employees are before they start and then afterwards, and stackable. You can complement different skill sets. And so this is just an example of an Illuminar microsim, and this is just a screenshot of it. The real thing is way more exciting. But if you've ever used one of these in the emergency preparedness context, it allows you to simulate the emergency response. So we're testing the protocol. We're basically doing response training. It allows us to work in a team and test our collaboration and really sort of vet our communication strategies. But what if there was also the capacity to not only look at what this looks like operationally, but to allow yourself to walk through it personally? So you're in a micro simulation, you're confronted with a scenario that's at least simulating the stress that you might feel in that particular scenario. And what if you were confronted with the questions that allow you to look at your decision-making capability or how you're managing your stress? What happens in your body? What happens in your brain? What's the mindset are you already thinking about catastrophe, or are you able to stay in that problem solving state? And what's the narrative that comes along with it? And then also the personal preparedness piece that we were just talking about, understanding. So, say the scenario is about a tropical storm and you live someplace that tropical storms don't typically hit. What does your personal preparedness look like for that? And you get to think about that before a disaster actually hits. And it gives you insight into your existing self awareness. So, we all have an anticipation of how we'll respond, like I did with my little house fire. But then seeing it in a micro simulation, it allows us to really gut check and determine how in tune we are with our capabilities and really understand where those weaknesses might lie. And finally, it gives us the opportunity to manage the stress when we're not dealing with it in real time. So that later on, if we are confronted with that scenario in real life, we've got that playbook. We've built that mental muscle, that resilience exists to help us get from that amygdala back to our cognitive brain, because our brain knows what to do. And beyond just looking at microsims in the disaster context, extrapolate this out. Like, think about this as a management tool, as a training tool. So say you have an employee that you sit down for your performance review, and you recognize that there are certain things that are really lacking and that you could help them cultivate their personal resilience. But you can just give them a microsim to do it, instead of just saying, I noticed that you take feedback really hard, and it would be great if you could be more receptive to feedback. What if you can give them a microsim where they're actually receiving pretty negative feedback and they get to walk through those steps for themselves? What happens in my brain? What's my mindset? What's the narrative? What am I telling myself about this feedback that's making me have such a negative emotional response to it? And what it allows you to do is not just have a targeted training tool, but also track the advancement of your employees. And at that executive level, if you have a dashboard showing the performance of your employees on these microsims, you have a crystal clear picture of where your personal strengths lie and where your weaknesses exist. And that allows you to really be laser focused and efficient in how you're delivering wellness and resilience trainings and resources. And now I'm going to turn it back to Paula, because I want to share a little bit about the resource that we are going to share with you at the end of this.
So that was fantastic, Katie, and thank you so much. We do have a question from Ken about whether you have research and metrics on what are the key milestones of success and a maturity model for organizations to follow.
So so this goes back to that definition of resilience that is so personal for us, but also personal to your organization. And so part of what I do with organizations is an agility audit that allows us to really understand, what does it mean to be resilient for this organization? And from there, developing what those key milestones are. Because the challenge with sort of applying a blanket statement to what are the milestones for success from an organizational level is that you're sort of you may be applying resources that you don't actually need. Within the personal context, I have sort of a program that does identify key milestones that are general enough that individuals can sort of do their own assessment, see where they fit, and then use resources that address each of those milestones as they need it. And I'm also happy to talk more about how that would apply in an organizational setting after the fact, Ken, if that would be helpful for you.
Yeah, and another thing to add to that, I think we're going to have a follow-on roundtable that brings together some of the concepts that we discussed today around the relationship between personal resilience and organizational resilience, but also this concept of archetypes, resilience archetypes, which we talked about earlier in the year. But I think the key thing there, really understanding different people's perceptions of resilience, right? And how they prefer to build resilience. And I think based on the research that we've done at Illuminator, there are different flavors of resiliency depending on the culture of your organization, the culture of your team or individuals, within kind of that kind of that macrocosm of the that the individuals and teams and so on and so forth make up. So yeah, definitely a topic that we will delve in more as we go. So we did put together this resource. Just going to share at a high level. We definitely want to leave a little time for questions and discussion. But in preparing for this webinar, one of the things that Katie and I had talked about is, well, how do we make this real for people? And with so much focus on organizational, operational resilience, and then on an individual basis, sort of giving people the resources, to maintain like their well-being. Like, how do we connect the two in a much more material way? And so what you'll find here is essentially a guide to these situational sort of story living, experiential learning exercises, really centered around, so it's 5 kind of different scenarios that we've laid out here. One around adapting to organizational change, one around work-life integration in a crisis. I'm sure no one on the phone has lived that one. We've got one around customer focus and uncertainty that really brings into play some of the themes that we're seeing around the insurability crisis, and how to navigate that from a customer centricity, but also personal resiliency perspective. Conduct risk, which is a major focus for many organizations, especially with key personnel or executives that may not necessarily have the bandwidth to stay on top of evolving regulations. How to ensure that they have the proper tools at their disposal to respond appropriately. SolarWinds is a great example of how or how executives in particular may not necessarily know how to respond in a way that's compliant, and making sure that they have the right tools in place to understand how to navigate those things. And then finally, I think we're all facing these really novel situations, right, where they're really unprecedented, and it certainly came into play as a result of COVID. But AI is another great example. We have a AI deep fake microsimulation that I know has provoked a lot of thought within the community. But how do you ensure that the people in your organization have the skills and the knowledge to navigate great uncertainty? And so we'll share this out after the webinar. Would definitely love your feedback on those things. And really the goal here is how do you connect these situations that we all experience, at an organizational level, professional level, as well as at an individual and personal level, in a way that really encourages people to live the situation before it happens. So anything you want to add there, Katie?
No, that was great. I think that this is an incredible resource just to sort of scratch the surface of this conversation, because for a lot of organizations, we understand that personal resilience is not yet in that fold of the sort of global enterprise resilience conversation, and it tends to exist in a different part of the organization altogether. And so these microsimulations offer a look at how a scenario could be used from the senior executive to the manager to the employee, and how there's really a personal resilience aspect for each of those positions with each scenario, while also considering how you might use the scenario to understand sort of the operational side of your process, but also the personal resilience side of what you're dealing with when you're managing that kind of disaster.
So with that, we will open it up to questions or commentary. All right. Looks like no questions at this time, but really appreciate your engagement throughout the session. We look forward to your feedback and participation in our future roundtable on this topic. If you haven't taken the quiz on resilience archetypes, this is something we launched earlier this year, and it's really A quick way, to assess, sort of where you stand on, so the whole concept is really that, resilience is built as an artifact of our attitudes and orientations on systemization, and engagement. And thinking through those particular attributes can help you better engage your organization, around the topic of building resilience. And so it's been a lot of fun to watch, your organizations and teams really engage on this topic and, compare notes, if you will. But it's a really useful asset, especially as it relates to how, those aspects of personal resilience and organizational resilience, really intersect. So go ahead and scan the QR code if you want to take that. You can also find it on our website. If you haven't, seen the guide to the playmakers, this is all about, risk management, resilience's role, compliance's role in the new game of business agility. So how do we better support the broader business in navigating uncertainty? And then finally, you love what Katie had to say today. Katie, you're always just such a, prolific, and engaging speaker. If you want to learn more about Katie's services, please scan the QR code, or reach out. And I know she'd love to get in touch.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you all. Have a great day. And
Thank
thanks again
you.
for joining us.